Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us for this conversation, these video chats with some of my most distinguished colleagues. This is The Long View. I'm Walter Grayson. It's amazing to welcome Ben Railton, who this is the first chance we've had to be in a live conversation. So this is a spectacular moment because for several years, we've been sharing material back and forth on social media in the format of the Scholar Sunday list of just extraordinary research and scholarship that people are doing in American studies. And so, Ben, thank you for making this minute come together for us. And thank you for everything you've done over all these years. This has been a path. How did you come to deciding that you wanted to do Scholar Sunday? And I think you said now you're at the 230th or thereabouts posts and collection blogs now that you have put up. So tell us how you came to it and where it's at. How did we get here?
Absolutely. And first of all, right back at you on all counts with all those very generous introductory thoughts. It's really great to be here and to be talking to someone else who has been doing the work so well and for so long. It's a real pleasure for me too. Yeah, I think the thread that's going to go up this weekend is the 237th or 8th. And it's over 5 years. It hasn't been every single weekend, but almost every weekend for just over 5 years that I've been sharing those, first on Twitter and now on Blue Sky, but also on a Substack, for the last year and a little bit. I duplicate them. And so it started. It was a really great chance to think about it when I knew I was going to talk to you because I was hoping that we would talk about them. And so there's a couple things I would say about why it started and then also how it's evolved that I know we'll keep talking about. One thing was just the feeling, and it's only deepened, over these 5 years, the feeling that there's a ton of great work being done all the time, and it's really easy to miss it. It's really easy to just be in a bubble, be in a particular lane, as we all are in one way or another, and so just miss things, not see things, not read things, not hear things. And then B, the flip side of that for the people doing it is it's really easy to feel like you're kind of putting stuff out there and it's just sort of like going up into the ether and not really finding audience, which is why we all want to write and talk and share our thoughts. And so, from both an audience standpoint and a kind of author or creator standpoint, it felt like it's easy for things to not connect. It's easy for them to kind of miss. And so, the starting point in a way was just saying, let me try to grab a few things. If you go back to the first ones, there's a Google document that has all of them. And if you go back to the first ones, it was like 5 or 6 things maybe that I was pulling. It was a very small number compared to how it has grown. But just trying to grab a few things and say, hey, here's a couple things that people can hopefully have a little more of a chance of finding, and that the people who created them can have a little more of a chance of finding an audience and a conversation. So that was part of where it started. And then the other place where it started, not coincidentally, in the summer of 2020, just over 5 years ago, was just the goal of community, the goal of kind of being in more solidarity with each other. That was obviously a moment when, as we all know, it was particularly difficult to find those things. But to be honest, I think post COVID, complicated as I know that phrase is, we are at least partly not in the summer of 2020 moment. But if anything, I think it's become even more important for every possible reason to find community and be in kind of solidarity with each other. And so it's not just about the work, although the work is obviously a big part of what I'm hoping to find and share and connect to and connect people to. But it's also about community and solidarity, which are just things that I'm really, really interested in trying to help support. It's a big part of why I've stayed on social media despite all of its incredible complications and frustrations. Is it's a place where those things can happen ideally. And so these threads feel like a way to try to help both share work, connect people to each other through work, but also share community and share solidarity. And they've grown in all sorts of ways, including so many great people, present company especially included, sharing work and adding things and making them communal even from the jump. But the main way that I think it has built is just that it has felt more and more like those two goals for me of more and more things that am seeing and finding or having shared and so on that I want to help connect people to. And more of a sense that it is a little bit of a community, that it is its own kind of bit of solidarity week in and week out that is really meaningful to me. And I hope and believe is really meaningful to other folks too. So both of those things were starting points, and they really have just kind of deepened over the 5+ years since.
That's no doubt. And the insight that you bring to the evolution of that specific product, that tool, that set of tools that you have provided, not only is it powerful and showcases so much important work, but I think a process of how you go about it'd be particularly interesting to folks. And for me, I come at the kind of process question behind the scenes, giving acknowledgement to founders before I saw your version of Scholar Sunday. So I think of Raul Pacheco, had done many, many years of work, particularly on the bridges between STEM fields and social sciences. And so that was just a regular feature of what became Scholar Sunday for me, I think as early as 2012 or 13. It had folks who are no longer in the academy and really trying to bridge with K to 12 education, were the folks doing Saturday School was the hashtag on Twitter before it became X. And Saturday School has flowered in so many ways where now the National Council of Social Studies has hundreds of these communities of educators who get together every week and share resources and do exactly what you're talking about with Scholar Sunday, and has been a crucial way to push back in the environment where education is under assault. And so I know you have seen so many different communities. For me, it's irresponsible, not to mention the founding role I had with the African American Intellectual History Society and kind of mentoring Ibram Kendi and Keisha Blaine and getting them off the ground and structuring that as a community. I think Rob Green is now president of the society. And so these areas, how have you seen and kind of responded to them as you've thought about what you put together for this kind of weekly announcement, this weekly moment for our communities at all levels?
Yeah, absolutely. And first of all, I totally agree. There are so many of these kind of parallel, complementary, connective threads and people, including all the ones you mentioned, yourself and all those folks and those communities, past, present, ongoing. I absolutely agree. And I do see any one part of it as a complement to those other things. And so I'm certainly not, not trying to duplicate the great work that's happening, nor um, see anyone, certainly not mine, as whatever a replacement or a next step, or that they're all ongoing in their own ways for sure, and so important each of those conversations. And I think a lot of them have migrated in one way or another to something like Blue Sky or to other spaces. A lot of them did start on Twitter for sure, and have migrated and kept growing and kept building, and that's all really important. And so I would say some of the time, for sure, I am pulling from other conversations, other spaces, but trying not to do that too much because they are out there and they are so strong and they are so vibrant. And so for me, the process is about gradually I have built up sort of a set of places and voices and spaces that I do see kind of week in and week out as places I hope to pull from for the thread. And the AAIHS is one of them, the Black Perspectives blog that they run. I certainly go there every day to see if there's something new that I want to include in the thread. And there are a bunch of other kind of parallel things that are, podcasts or spaces like Contingent Magazine or certain people's newsletters, et cetera, that I know that I'm always going to kind of keep an eye on. And so there's that part of the process. But then the other two things, one is people sharing things. And I'll just say, anybody watching this, anybody listening to this, um, that could happen a lot more probably than it does. And I would get more stuff then because I'm still one person for sure. And so people sharing things is great. It's really, really helpful because I miss so much. I end every thread by saying I'm sure I missed a lot, and that's really a genuine thing because I know I'm sure I did. So sharing things, and then the other thing I was actually just talking about with my wife, and I think this is not just a point about the threads, but I think it's an important point for everybody. When I am on Blue Sky, I'm always looking for things for the thread. And it is a real sanity saver for me because so much of what's on social media, even when you have a great, bubble that you might be part of, is really tough these days, is really sad and angry and frustrating and painful for all of us. And that's not going to obviously completely change. We can't change that world. But when I'm on there, if I'm looking for things, if I'm finding things, if I'm seeing work, it helps me kind of feel like there's something productive, there's something meaningful, not just the doom and the doom scrolling. So people share things with me. That's great. I have places I go for sure, but then I also just kind of am on there periodically looking for great work and great voices and things to share, and that helps make it feel really productive and meaningful, and not just the horrors, but the responses and the resistance and all the work. And as you say, none of that's new. But in 2025, all of it is even more crucial than it's ever felt to me. And so those are all part of the process. But I guess that last one I would really highlight for folks because I think it's a way to kind of be in these spaces where it can feel meaningful. Like I'm looking for voices and work that I want to share, that I want to highlight, even when it's in response to the worst of what's happening. It makes it feel a little more optimistic at the same time.
Absolutely right. To keep our sanity and to keep our sense of positive movement forward, we need it, and you're one of the key sources. I will say two things. There's a subheading to one of them.
Mhm.
Um, if ever possible, visit the Metropole by the
Mm,
Urban
mm,
History Association.
mhm,
That's the piece that I really worked hard to found after Black
mhm.
Perspectives.
I'm going to
And
write that
so
down for this week. Yes, keep going.
so whenever you have a chance to visit them, they do amazing things.
Hmm.
Then two others that kind of line up with what you do on Sundays. I thought I'm trying to build a connection with
Hmm.
your version of Scholar Sunday. As Digi Mentors and
Hmm.
Srinivasan is
Hmm.
all I think YouTube, Facebook kind of video content. And
Hmm.
so even if it's a week after they've done their live piece, they're amazing. And then Sunday nights, after I have done my Scholar Sunday reading, I often join historians at the
Hmm.
movies. And I
Hmm.
see sometimes they will crop up in the Scholar Sunday. But
Hmm.
those, I think that Sunday experience for me has become just an island, a paradise for me on the weekends, where I can get up, start reading Scholar Sunday, watch the New York Times read along, come back, read more Scholar Sunday, and then wrap up the night by watching a movie and being part of the historians at the movies community. And there are so many ways to do all of that in with all of these kinds of new forms of expression. And that's kind of where I find your work, but that kind of experience on my Sunday to be really amazing is I broadcast television, cable news is almost unwatchable for me at this point. And part of it is being an academic, and the kinds of things and the level of the conversation can become very frustrating when you know there's better info in the world and it's not making it into the mass media. And so I wanted to see, how are you kind of envisioning the way all of this may move forward? I'm hopeful about our shared platforms reshaping the
Hmm.
possibility of what the world knows about itself in the next year, 2 years, 5 years, whatever. But what are you seeing in terms of the possibilities of what you're doing and what you see other people doing, and what its potential is going forward?
Yeah, that's you've already said a lot of great things, but I'll follow them up. And there's kind of three things that I want to highlight, I think. And I'll start by saying that's actually a really like just feels really personal to me because for a long time I said one of my dream jobs was to be a voice that would go on like those Sunday shows and just raise your hand and be like, no, that's not true. That's not accurate. That's not history. You're wrong about that. Um, and we could use that, but I agree that what we could really use is just alternatives because I think it may be a little bit too late for a lot of those conversations to be anything beyond what the ceiling of them is, and it's a pretty low ceiling. And so I guess, yeah, three things that I want to quickly say. One is a longer term thing, which is that my wife and I have a project that's going to be hopefully a public scholarly kind of site, a website kind of space. And that's going to start more in the fall. It's something I'll talk more about down the road. It's still very early, but I do think more and more, yeah, we have to see this as our ability not just to do individual things or moments, but to shape spaces and conversations. And you've done that all over the place as you've talked about here. And so I totally agree. I think that's a really good long-term goal. That's one thing to say. A second kind of related thing to say, I would say, is that as we're talking about here, there are so many of those already, including the ones that you've helped create, like AIHS and the Metropole, and so many of these other spaces. And I think we still have to get better. And I'm trying to do my part, and we all are, at connecting them, right? So it's not just these, because even just like in terms of their subject matter, or K to 12 versus higher ed, or whatever, early American versus 20th century American, it feels like they still can be kind of bubbles at times, and that's not going to completely change, and it shouldn't, because conversations are different from each other. But just finding those ways to link them, to connect them, to create new spaces, but also, and just as importantly, keep connecting the spaces and the communities that exist already, and finding these opportunities to do that, even if it's like a weekly space, like something like these Sunday ones that you're mentioning, for the people who are looking for that. There's nothing wrong with being specialized at times, of course, but a lot of us I know really want those connections and those conversations. So that's a second thing. And then the third thing that I would say, um, and this is related, but I think it's worth saying since we haven't explicitly mentioned in this conversation yet, the teaching side and the classroom side, is that so many of us, including you, I know, and me and others, have been doing that as part of this for so long, right? And that it's not separate either, right? And we know that now when we see these attacks on higher ed and these attacks on education and the work that we do, and the idea that AI can do what we do for our job, or all these narratives, all these attacks that also minimize the classroom side and the teaching side. And so another way that I kind of envision this continuing to move forward is making that link more and more clear. I've talked for at least 15 years about public scholarship as just another layer of teaching, right? That's part of what we're doing. Like you said, changing the way we know things, we think about things, we learn things. That doesn't just happen in classrooms, that happens in a variety of ways, including classrooms, including teaching. And those of us who've been teaching a lot over our careers are in a place where we can really help make that connection, help make that clear. And so just making sure that as we're building spaces, as we're connecting spaces, we're also connecting it to teaching and connecting it to classrooms, and all the work that happens at our educational institutions, um, which also all these things can then support each other, right? And can make clear how each of them is a vital part of the work. And so that's just another way that I hope it can keep building and evolving. For so long, at least in my lifetime and my career, there was this narrative that the teaching side and the research side were separate from each other, or the scholarly side and the teaching side, whatever we want to say. And a lot of us know that's never been true. It's never been in our careers. And the more we can make that also part of the conversation, I think the better too. So.
Yeah, so this is my last kind of formal piece because it builds directly off of that point. And for me, like you said, this is one of the most personal pieces of it. And we offline, like aside from what we do that faces the public with Scholar Sunday or any of the kind of social media stuff I do, we've talked about kind of how do you measure impact?
Mhm.
And when you look at audience engagement, how do you figure that out? And so I'm looking at all of these, and on the academic side of it, there's a really important, like they measure through your citations, your impact factor, and can evaluate, the merit of your work using some of these platforms. And I look at something, for me, this came to a point, I want to say between 2016 and 2018, when Black Perspectives really hit its stride.
Mhm.
And it really forced the American Historical Association to abandon a long-held position that digital scholarship didn't exist. Like
Right.
this was not legit kind of academic work. And so for Black Perspectives to win an award from the American
Mhm.
Historical Association opened the door up. It led to very successful scholars like Kevin Cruz or Heather Cox Richardson to then move into the social media space aggressively and really transformed the way academic scholarship was done on a daily basis
Mhm.
with the ways that they posted and communicated. I mean, I think at one point Kevin made dunking on Dinesh trend
Yeah, yeah,
at various points.
yeah,
And so there's just a different way that people were getting access to scholarship, which I do believe triggered a lot of the educational backlash that we're seeing now,
yeah.
is that the level of discourse was increasing and politicians lined up to say, no, we don't want this information to be legitimized and distributed and to transform public discourse. And I saw this very pointedly after the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, that the way activists and young people could articulate themselves were using all of the tools that things like Scholar Sunday were putting on the table. And so that work and that transition about how we show academic impact versus how then we take public engagement seriously. How do you kind of find your path there? Because I know you've taken on some new strategies. I shouldn't say new, it's been a couple of years, but like where you pointedly go at high follower count accounts
Mhm.
that you include in the post to say, listen, tap this, just share this with
Mhm.
your people. You're part of this. And
Mhm.
so how do you think about that what's taken credibly academically, and then how do you do the kind of public engagement piece that you need for this work to really have the best life it can?
Yeah, it's a great multi-part question. And one thing I'll say off the top is that I'm in a position of privilege because I'm tenured already. I'm a full professor, and so I come at it, and that was true in 2020. Yeah, that was already true in 2020 for sure. So I'm starting my 21st year at Fitchburg State. I've been here a long time. I mean, I thank you. So I started, at that place, and so that is different, certainly for early career folks, younger folks. Which just gives us even more responsibility to try to do what we can, as you're nicely pointing out. And I start with that because I will say one piece of it for me is trying to, for those people who are in higher ed, who are in academia in one way or another, making sure that we work to transform those conversations, um, to help make sure these things are equally valued, or at least valued complementarily to whatever peer reviewed publication and so on. And I think there's been progress with that. I know there are various places, including the higher ed contract that my university is part of, where scholarly work can mean things like online writing for sure, and all sorts of other forms, all sorts of other things that aren't just a peer reviewed journal or the like. So I think we are starting to change that conversation. It's a long road to keep walking, but that's part of it, is changing the way institutions perceive things and value things. And that includes the AHA, as you said, institutions like that, universities, accrediting agencies, whatever, everybody, anybody. So there's that piece of it. But yeah, the follow up to that is it's not going to be identical. It's not going to be measurable like a citation or like a peer review in the same way, and so on. So it is about then figuring out, how do we think about engagement? How do we think about impact, as you said? And yeah, part of it for me was this recognition that because of the way algorithms work and social media work, um, there are certain, whatever accounts, voices, et cetera, that hit certain thresholds that can have that immediate impact, that sort of blossoming impact, right? And so I have gotten much less. I have no shame. There's no shame in the game of saying, share these things, be part of these things. My assumption, and I think it's a very good assumption, is that if people are in these spaces, they want to be part of these spaces. And if people are posting and sharing in these spaces, they want to post and share. They want to add those to the conversation. I take that in good faith, and I think it's true of most folks. And so, absolutely, I'm very, very willing to say the only way these things get engaged, the only way they get impact, is when they, I tell two friends and they tell two friends and they tell two friends, and the people who have a million friends can tell a lot more people a lot more quickly, than anyone else can. So I definitely think we have to both change the way institutions think for sure, but also keep thinking about what engagement and impact means in these public social media, online, digital kinds of spaces and conversations, and keep finding ways to tap into that and to ask folks to be part of it. Um, just as forthrightly as possible. And I think most of the time, most folks are very willing to respond and to be part of it because we all do have those shared goals. And it does feel, to go back to my first things in this good conversation, it does feel, I think, really gratifying to individuals when we are finding those audiences and connecting. So yeah, I think it's about changing the conversation and really just continuing to think about what does it look like to collectively aim for those goals of engagement and impact, and then figure out, as I know you've been doing, ways that we can like approximate it or measure it, but also just keep asking people to be part of it. I think that's a real big step, whether that's institutions or individuals or journalists, whoever, and as many as possible, just saying like join these efforts, because the benefit of it, as I know you feel too, is that there is a democratic potential, right? That for a long time there were real gatekeepers for each of those things, institutions, higher ed, whatever.
Yes.
Obviously, that's still a part of it, but there are ways that we can create new doors that aren't just those gates, and then think about how we, how we get as many people into them as possible. So,
That's so well said. And that point on gatekeeping and new doors. Yeah, that's a priceless point just to put out there to the world at this place. Because again, when I think of Ibram and Keisha and Nicole Hannah Jones,
mhm.
like these people were on the margins and were not, they were under assault themselves long before the backlash came and were junior. They were
Yeah.
trying to get through their tenure reviews and trying to get through the place where they could build their own institutions. And they've done so in spectacular ways. And so that's what I see as so vital for young scholars, whether they're in school or getting a degree that's going to let them teach or moving on to something where they want to pursue a career in research. There are so many doors that have been created in the last decade that they're not bound to really some very poisonous kinds of gatekeeping that had happened over the previous century, to decide who had a legitimate voice and access to the public. I do want to take this quick minute just to kind of highlight the thing that I've mentioned to you on multiple platforms is that when I did the racial violence syllabus post after the Unite the Right rally in 2017, that got over 1 million direct engagements, from various people around the world. It got translated into 7 languages. But when I really dug into the data using a platform called NodeXL, I looked at the average follower count
Mhm.
for all of those 1 million engagements. And it was like 4,000 people for each engagement. And then that's what yields this notion that there were over 4 million clicks on that or 4 billion clicks on that content over about a 2 week window. And it's very similar to something that happened to me back in like 2008. I taught a class where students produced short films, and the best of the short films reached like 250,000 people in a week. And I was just like, hold up. I'm lucky if a book is read by like 10 or
Right.
12 people. And yet this other kind of multimedia content is reaching masses of folks who find the content useful. The Wakanda syllabus had a
Mhm.
similar kind of impact. The fact that I can look at this weekend, Marvel Studios put out Eyes of Wakanda as an animated series, and it's full of content that came out of the Wakanda syllabus. Like almost every episode is like, oh, you're talking about the way that history operates and its impact on the way a civilization exists in the world. Like no other
Mhm.
Marvel series comes close to doing anything like that, and it's because of the kind of discourse that we foster. And most recently, of course, is graphic history.
Mhm.
In the last 2 years, the celebration of the hip hop culture at the 50th anniversary, the fact that it reaches the New York City school system and it's 1 million kids get to read about hip hop as their social studies curriculum. Like again, I think when we first launched the graphic novel last April, we had over 2 billion engagements. And like the demands are now, we don't have enough. Like, we can't get it
Mhm.
into people's hands fast enough. So that's, I want to be encouraging to people who are looking at those alternative doors. I've seen people doing dissertations that are graphic histories. I'm seeing all kinds of scholars, late career, mid-career, early career, all producing graphic content. And got to highlight Trevor Getz. Trevor Getz and his work with Oxford University Press and blazing the trail professionally for people to take graphic history seriously, particularly in African history circles,
Mm.
just opened unbelievable opportunities that are still unfolding. So, in the context of your answer, I just wanted to give a little bit
Sure.
of background, a little bit deeper inside baseball about the relationship between scholarly impact and then public engagement. Um, I've taken over a half hour of peppering you with things. I did want this to be something where other questions, other topics you want to put on the table for us. Where would you like to go, given what we've set out in the first half of this?
I appreciate that, and first of all, thank you for all of those, for all of that really great perspective and information, particularly about, again, not just the idea of how we measure these, but also then of the real effects that we can see in schools, in publishing industries, in the conversations. I think again, there's a lot of ways to measure and or at least to perceive and share where and how these things are impacting the conversations. And I really agree with that. One thing I wanted to mention that is another layer of the conversation as well, and is related, of course, to the space in which we're talking right now, is part of my recent kind of evolution and something I'm still thinking a lot about also is how in podcasts and kind of multimedia conversations, as you just put it too, how that can also help open up different ways of telling stories. So I just wanted to mention, for example, last fall, about a year ago exactly, just under a year ago, I had the first example of that of mine, a narrative history podcast. It was a story that I had been fascinated with from American history for a long, long time. The story of this Chinese American baseball team, the Celestials, in the 1870s, and their last game in particular in San Francisco in 1881, and all the kind of layers that that moment opens up. And also, as an inside baseball thing, pun intended, I was trying to make that a book for a long, long time. And I had an agent, and there was a proposal and sample chapters and all that stuff. And it never happened. And it gradually evolved in my thinking through a bunch of different conversations with a bunch of different folks into this idea of a narrative podcast instead. And as I did that, as I worked on it and created it and shared it and have kept thinking about it, it really, really became not just sort of like a different step, but it opened up for me what those kinds of multimedia spaces and conversations can help us do or allow us to do that are not going to replace writing, but are their own thing, are their own important thing. And so that's something I'm really continuing to think about. I'm thinking about a second season on a different kind of baseball story, probably the field at Manzanar, the Japanese concentration camp during World War II, where they built a baseball field and played some really important, complicated games. The folks who were incarcerated there. And so, like, that is a specific example of something I'm continuing to think about. A second season, another story, another history. But then just another example also, like graphic histories or so many other things that I think still probably many folks, maybe too many folks, perceive as not scholarly, right? As not educational, as their own thing, right? Maybe entertainment or fun or whatever. And they can be all those things. But podcasts, multimedia, spaces, conversations, etc., can be just as much public scholarly and education, all the things we've been talking about. And I'm really interested in that. Obviously, a lot of people have been doing that work really well for a long, long time. So it's not something new, but just to keep building it and keep figuring out how do we make that another set of doors, another set of possibilities, or just keep opening them and keep inviting more and more people in. Again, it's been a thing. There have been people pioneering that work for a long time, but just opening it more and more for more folks, more audiences, more creators, more voices. So that's a space that I'm really interested in continuing to think about. And obviously, it's not. There's conversational podcast spaces like this one that I really love, and then there's just the opportunity for individual people to think about it, which is what I tried to do in mine, just to create a little bit of that space of my own thinking and writing and work. So just all the different ways that spaces like that can be part of it too.
Yeah, it's so important. And I do need to give a special thanks to my institution, Macalester College. At the moment that they hired me to come in and kind of re-envision what history is in a liberal arts context. Um, they were in the midst of a 2, 3 year debate about, okay, how do we evaluate non-traditional academic subjects? And so one of the first responsibilities I had was to join that committee, and they were frankly demoralized
Mhm.
because there were several naysayers, senior leaders among the faculty that just didn't want to hear it. And Macalester is a place that is the most faculty governed I've seen in 25 years. It's much more driven by faculty insight and governance than I've been around probably 200 other
Mhm.
places. And it was amazing to see just faculty voice prevail the way it does here. But in this particular instance, there was just real hostility and barriers against exactly what you're advocating for. And it took us about a year and a half to slowly turn the ship. But when it came up to a final faculty vote to include a wider array of top standards for scholarly accomplishments, it passed 88 to 1. And so now the battle is making that work through the promotion and tenure process, like
Mhm.
being in the committee room and making sure people don't just fall back on old habits. But I'm glad places like Michigan State have done it. I've seen a couple schools in New Jersey move in that direction. You were just saying Fitchburg has gone
Mhm.
and done more. And I've even seen the AHA and the OAH say, okay, this is the time we need to recognize as a chance to open up what's possible. So there's just so much going, and I know like I wanted to say there's so much you've done with Saturday Evening Post, and I'm
Mhm.
always clicking and checking out what you're putting out through there. So all of media is changing, and so how has that been? Like it seems like that was maybe a foundation for you, what you were already doing with the Post to then move into what you
Mhm.
did with the Scholar Sunday.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And when I think about my personal arc of a career, it has been, just broadly speaking, the move from what I would call academic, at least in the old school traditional sense of those naysayers at Macalester, let's say, or even like my dissertation and my first book, which was very academic in a lot of ways, from academic to public is like the big arc that I would describe. And we've talked about a lot of layers of that already. But I think the follow up thing for me to talk about a little bit here is again just even as an individual writer and scholar. We've talked a lot about all the communal levels and the multimedia levels and websites and spaces, but even just as an individual voice that we all are trying for as well. That has been the arc, and it includes the idea of like one's own space. I'm about to have the 15th anniversary of my blog, my American Studies blog, in November. I started that in 2010, November 2010. So that was kind of a first piece of that, and I love that. And I've kept doing it. It means a lot to me. But that was obviously very individual. And so then, yeah, gradually finding places and spaces where I could think about that idea of public writing, of public scholarly writing, and the post has been one of the most important. That was January 2018 that I started having the chance to write a column for that space, and so 7.5 years now, and that really was a place where it felt like the individual things I had been able to do could become more like a central part of the work and a central part of my voice. That then has absolutely connected me to so many other parts of my work, but also other people's work and other spaces, and that idea of that solidarity and that idea of wanting to make sure they find each other. Because again, they can still be in these kind of these bubbles to a degree where there's like the post readers or the Metropole readers or the Black Perspectives readers. And so again, just being as fully committed as possible to saying, what does it look like when we try to put them in relationship to each other and in conversation with each other. And so for my individual writing, that was a huge part of that move from academic to public. And it has led to lots of other things for sure. But also just thinking about, again, connecting the network of people and spaces that are doing that. Because I think one thing about academic publishing was that it felt like the connections already existed, right? That if you got your draft to X journal might publish it. As you said earlier, who would then read it was a totally different and often very negligible question, but there was that pipeline anyway. whereas there weren't really built-in pipelines for those of us who were thinking about these other spaces. So A, we're trying to kind of like navigate them ourselves, but B, and even more importantly, build those connections between them and those networks between them. And then between them and again, the classroom, and between them and institutions, um, so that the model that academic publishing had, with probably a much smaller set of audiences, we can try to then have those connections and those networks in these public spaces and these public conversations with much bigger audiences, as you're saying, at least potentially and possibly. So I think it's the best of both worlds, ideally, where we can still be doing the rigorous, connected, networked, shared work, but also doing it for all different possible audiences and all different spaces. And that's, I hope, in the arc of my career so far, and I hope for the rest of it. And I think it's a huge part of what we're all in 2025 trying for. And at the end of the day, I hope even those kind of naysayer folks would recognize, if we don't do that, it's going to be really hard to sustain any of our spaces if we can't keep building those connections, those networks, those audiences, that sense of the stakes of what we do and why we do it. We're not going to be able to endure. So I think more and more, that's not only my personal arc, but I hope the arc for all of us in a lot of ways that we're trying to be in together.
Yeah, and at the moment when folks want to tear down what higher education, what humanities education, what interdisciplinary education is, the core idea of what counts as education, it's so important to take some new strategies to the table and come together so that our strengths are mutually reinforcing or are cumulative. So that's always a challenge. Um, I had a different kind of question, was much more about kind of state that we're in and beyond just what we're doing in the spaces where we've developed things like Scholar Sunday and are cultivating this work. Do you see new frontiers? Do you see new opportunities that maybe you didn't see when you started out? I think you kind of lean this way with your upcoming project. I don't want you to focus on when something that is not ready to come out just yet.
Mm.
But what do you, if you had someone who was just getting started at whatever level and they wanted to get out, say an eighth grader, ninth grader, or maybe someone even starting or finishing college, and they're interested to kind of go further with this, what kind of advice would you give them?
It's a really good question. And I appreciate you're asking it about younger folks, because my first thought when you were framing that question, and I will mention this because I really love these kinds of programs, and I think we all, it's an opportunity for everybody beyond what maybe is highlighted, which is adult education programs, programs for older folks.
Hmm.
I've taught at a bunch of different ones up here in Massachusetts, and I really love that space, because part of it is also making sure we keep connecting to people long past, the college student age. And so that's one thing I would say. Everybody around them has those kind of programs at one place or another, and teaching for them, connecting to them is such a great way to build community. So I did
Indeed.
want to say that I really love adult ed, lifelong learning kind of programs. I think they're great stuff. But on the flip side of that, yeah, if we're thinking about young folks coming through, younger even than our kids' ages at that kind of early point still, I guess I would say a really big emphasis of mine for that conversation would be to find and read and share voices that really kind of speak to whoever that young person is, right? And in particular, to try to find the ones that are not, and this is not an easy thing, but that are not leaning into, the sort of clickbaity um, version of it, right? Because I know, just talking about, say, young men, for example, like my sons were not too long ago. They're a little older than that teenage age now. But there's a lot of voices out there, but a lot of them are more that clickbaity kind of voice, right? That version of podcasting, or that version of the pundits that they might. And so, being able to recognize the ones that are trying for that kind of clickbait clout, and then the alternative, finding voices that really are trying to do kind of thoughtful, nuanced, complicated writing and work about whatever it is, right? About film or about comics or about masculinity, whatever it is, right? There are so many of those voices. And now more than ever, as we've been saying, they're democratically sort of available to us, right? But you've got to be able to find them and connect to them. And so I hope we all keep doing the work of highlighting things and sharing things also for young folks and saying, like, here are some voices you can be learning from, right? The Wakanda syllabus is a great example, right? If you're reading those comics, if you're watching those films, you know, don't just see what like a kind of clout chasing, you know, video channel might have to say about it, but look at some of these other voices and see kind of how they can help you build that conversation. An example from this year for me would be the film Sinners. I think an amazing opportunity to like open up so many conversations, right? And open up so many topics for younger viewers, for all different audiences. So on our side, finding ways to share the voices and the spaces that are really thoughtfully engaging with things like that rather than just like clickbait kind of engagement. And then for young folks, again, seeking that out and really trying to find voices that you could say, that's somebody who's digging into this in a way that really feels, you know, again, thoughtful and like a model for how I might want to, you know, dig into these things and talk about these things. And then, you know, entering those conversations, right? Because if once you start reading them and hearing them, you can then figure out where and how you want to add your voice and add your thoughts, which 13-year-old can and should do just as much as an 81-year-old in an adult learning program, right? So just thinking about those steps of, you know, of finding the more positive, productive, meaningful spaces and voices, leaning into them and then joining them, entering the conversation. And again, I think there's more and more of it, but part of what we're all trying to do is figure out how to highlight it and share it and connect people to it and encourage them to be part of it in opposition to the voices and spaces that are again kind of modeling the much less productive conversations.
Yeah, no, it takes me back to the good night and good luck kinds of
Hmm.
conversations
Hmm.
about, the power of the new medias that we
Hmm.
create, but then the inherent dangers that if they're
Hmm.
used for the simplest, most basic kinds of outcomes,
Hmm.
driven by profit, um, that doesn't serve the best of what we can do as human beings.
Yeah, I agree. And I think now more than ever, it's this opportunity to say one of the phrases that I use all the time. Both my wife and my sons are very sick of it, I'm sure, is the worst and the best of us, right?
Mhm.
And a lot of my work, that's what I'm interested in. But I think also, if we think about these spaces, right, it's why I don't want to abandon social media. It's why I don't want to, you know, retreat at all from any of these kinds of conversations and spaces because they can be part of the best, but we have to be willing to say, here's where it's at its worst. How do we offer something that's a meaningful alternative to that? And again, I think in 2025, not only is that really important to work collectively, but it's good for our own individual souls to feel like we're able to find those ways to be part of that and to do that. And that can mean a billion different things, right? The other thing I would say to a young person is, you know, start a blog or a newsletter, right? And say like, what's my contribution to that? Because it's not just about reading and listening to other people. You're going to have things to say and to share, and that feels both personally and collectively like a step that we can take. And in this
Yes.
moment, again, there's a lot of things we can't control, but those are things that we can a little bit anyway.
We're coming down to the end of our hour, so like I want to make sure I can fill the time. Were
Great.
there other things that I've missed or things that you wanted to add or areas that we can explore together?
Um, I mean, I also can talk as long as time is in existence. But I mean, if you had other questions or things you wanted to touch on, this is your great new multimedia space here. So I'm excited to be in it. And if you had other things to add or raise or ask about, I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, so for me, it's there's so many. I guess again, being kind of personal with this is in the last 4 years, both of my parents have passed away. And a huge lesson for me as a scholar, so much of my world was shaped by people at least 40 years older than me.
Mhm,
As I grew up, because my parents were essentially 40 years older when they had
mhm,
me.
mhm,
And so I came to realize how different the world that they grew up in pretty fast.
mhm,
That my mother was living in a rural county seat town,
mhm,
but still on her block, it was like a luxury that they had like a community phone where if the phone rang, you ran from house to house to figure out where the person was that was being sought for the phone call. Um, if they had a radio in the house, it was an extraordinary luxury. There were no televisions.
mhm.
Going to films might be the 5 cent show or the 10 cent show. I think I just paid $50 to go see a film with my 14-year-old. So like it's a different world. And I'm very attentive to the way the worlds are different. In fact, that's why I was just telling a group of senior citizens we're doing oral histories with. Take time to look back through your scrapbooks and think about how different the world that you grew up in is from what your children or grandchildren are experiencing and use those as points of connection. Um, are there kind of benchmarks for you in thinking about this? I guess I just did a course 2 years ago on the digital history of the 21st century, so that
Mhm,
my students got to talk about when they got their first Facebook account or when they got
mhm,
their first
mhm.
mobile phone and kind of these benchmarks in their adolescence as they now move into young adulthood. Um, how do you look at those kinds of questions and topics over time and start to tease out the ways that people understand the important moments that shape their lives?
Yeah, it's a great question, and classrooms are one place where we can do it so productively, with that example you just mentioned, and I have a multi-generational family history, project that I use in a couple different classes for that reason, 'cause it asks students to talk to family members and to, look into their own history and identity, and then connect it to, like, things we've read or histories that we've looked at in the class. So that's one space for sure. But then for me, and first of all, I'm very sorry for your loss. I lost my dad in March this year, so I feel you. And that's a connection to what I was going to say for me, which is my hometown, which happens to be Charlottesville, Virginia, where that rally you mentioned earlier took place. Um, and so has become a lightning rod in the last 8 years in particular. But I think is an example of how place and space serve as those powerful benchmarks and can really work well as ways to highlight that, right? As places to think about that. And just as one small example, across the street from the house I grew up in and the house where my mom is still living. And we're going to be going there in a couple days to be with her for about a week in Charlottesville. Right across the street is a swimming pool. And it's a swimming pool that I grew up going to as a kid. And that's a swimming pool that was, when I was born in the 70s, still racially segregated, even though it wasn't legally allowed to be. It was. And that's part of Charlottesville for sure, as I've written about in a bunch of different spaces. Its histories long before Unite the Right of all the worst of our kinds of histories. But it's also a place that connects to multiple levels of Charlottesville history, to multiple changes over time. There was a movie theater there in like 1905 at the very start of the idea of kind of movies as a thing, or an entertainment complex that showed these very early shorts. And then after that, it became this kind of exclusive resort for a time, and then it became more of a public swimming pool. And so, like that one space and that one part of Charlottesville, and then the multiple kind of stories that it might connect to, and then how that can be traced through our identities and our journeys as individuals, like I ask students to do with that project, but kind of thinking about that in my own
Mhm.
home, in my own life, with my own multi generational story. So yeah, I think asking those questions, and I know something both you and I are really invested in it, and you've said a couple times today that things are personal, for you, and I agree, and making clear that that's part of the work too, right? Part of the problem with academic publishing for a long time was that it treated the personal as not scholarly, right?
Mhm.
I think about how much I was taught as a student that you never use first person pronouns in your writing. And I use them all the time in my writing. And I tell my students, some people are going to require you not to. Fine, you can learn that skill. As far as I'm concerned, you should use them whenever you are feeling like you are sharing your perspective as part of the work and your identity and your experience and your motivations. And all of that becomes more and more possible when we dig into those things, right? Those multi-generational stories of family, of identity, of place, of community. And I think that's all part of the work we do with students, but it's also part of our work and public scholarly work and these spaces and conversations. And so, like, I try to just keep that in mind with my own work as much as I do with teaching or with other parts of it. And I think place allows for that. I think identity allows for that. And certainly making sure, as you said at the start of your thoughts, that just then that you are listening to the voices and the perspectives of others as well, whether it is older generations or just other versions of those experiences, and learning from each other. I guess the other thing I would say about public scholarship as teaching is it's a conversation, right? I know both you and I are not the kind of teachers who think of teaching as a lecture, right? It's a conversation. So if we think of teaching as a conversation, then we can think of public scholarship as a conversation, learning from each other's versions of those things as we try to share our own versions of them too.
Yeah, that's a vital lesson. And you actually cued a point that I do want to highlight that'll take us a little bit over if it's not too bad for you. Um, Student asked me maybe 3 years ago when I first coming to McAllister, why should I major in American studies versus American or versus history? And it's a hard thing for me to say out loud for the record, how I had been trained to kind of come at that question. And I say this to say that I'm not satisfied with my answer. I'm asking you just very
Mm.
straightforwardly how to improve my answer. Um, I came from a world in my undergraduate experience where my primary mentor was emphatic. I can't say strongly enough how directly he said this. He's like, you're going to go on and get your PhD. You get it in history, not in any area studies or in a field that's kind of interdisciplinary. The stability of history as a profession will always allow you to move in and out of other places in a way that an interdisciplinary degree will not. And I will be honest, he was really emphatic about not getting a PhD in African
Mm.
American studies. And frequently in my career that comes across. Like I deal with a lot of folks. I would say even folks today online are like, why history and not Black studies? And having just embraced a Black studies community really aggressively for one of my recent projects, it's a line that I'm always having to negotiate and kind of explain in one way or another. But I'm not asking you to answer kind of my students' question about which thing they should major in. But what is your sense of the relationship between kind of traditional disciplines and these fields that challenge us to kind of use newer methods and to reimagine methodologies in our work? What has been your experience with walking among those kinds of conversations and misperceptions?
Yeah, and I have a similar kind of arc in that, like, my undergrad major was an interdisciplinary one, a major called history and literature. But then my PhD was an English PhD, and I'm in an English department. I have been for these 20 plus years at Fitchburg State. So I seem to fit within one of the more kind of silos rather than the interdisciplinary things. Um, but I would say two things. I would, well, first, to preface it, I think it has been true and it may still be true, although who the heck knows with professional questions in 2025. But it may still be true that the more defined disciplines and departments can have more of that sort of stable through line. Although I think anybody who is aiming for a job as the goal, like, there's no roadmap to that anymore, if there ever was, and there was more so for sure. I don't think there is anymore. So I don't know that we can even really in any practical way think about the professional path as one thing anymore or one answer anymore. But even if that is still somewhat true, I would say that the work that we all are doing has to be interdisciplinary in 2025. It just does. The silos might matter for, like, how institutions run and their hierarchy, and they might matter for jobs, although again, that's a fraught question. But I think the work has to be interdisciplinary. And because then if we acknowledge that, then we are forced to try to think about that in meaningful ways? What am I taking from different perspectives? And what voices do I have to read and listen to in these different perspectives? And how do I keep trying to strengthen my work in these different conversations and with these different disciplines? And the follow up to that, if we're talking about public audiences, in my general experience, they don't care at all about what category you call something. They want the stories, the histories, the work, the ideas, the conversations, the inspiration, the challenges, all the things that we get from the work. So I think for our own work, it's important to recognize that we need to be interdisciplinary and then grapple with what that looks like. And then the flip side of that is for the audiences that we're hoping to connect to, I don't think they care what we call it, how we define it. They want the work. They want
Hmm.
the things that we're dealing with. So I think there are some institutional meanings still, but for both us and for audiences, I think it's all about what we're engaging rather than kind of how we define it or what category we put it in. And again, that means being rigorous. I think interdisciplinarity isn't something we can just, draw from willy nilly without recognizing the rigors of trying to be interdisciplinary. But it also then opens up the possibility of just sharing the work wherever and however we want to try to do that without feeling limited by a category or a discipline.
No, I really appreciate the way you frame that and approach it. It's such an important way to go at it because I will say most of the students in humanities here at the college are not looking at scholarly careers. They're looking at ways to go out and make a difference in the world.
Mhm.
And so I tend to advise them towards interdisciplinary areas because they get more skills.
Mhm.
Um, the folks who are coming looking for the bachelor's in history that have a predisposition towards, a PhD
Mhm.
and a particular kind of PhD, that by which I mean they want to go to Stanford or Yale or, one of these places. Um, they're committed to a different kind of tradition of history that, yeah, like I don't know any of these really high-end academically celebrated programs that are taking particularly an African American Studies PhD and then
Mhm.
bringing them through an applicant pool to be hired in a history department.
Yeah.
Like I haven't seen that.
Right.
And as offensive as it is to me, it'd be wrong for me to tell a student that they could do it given whatever constraints exist within these institutions. So, the fact that I get a question like that from like a sophomore in college, like talks about the kinds of folks who I run
Yeah.
into there. But
Yeah.
like it's just such a hard map to give them a fair reading so they can make their best decision.
It is, but I think that's well said. That I mean, A, it's individual and it's specific, but then B, even as we are thinking about what the path might look like for individuals, we're also trying to think, as we've been talking about this whole time, what is the big map that we're all trying to connect to? And that is, I think, fundamentally an interdisciplinary one.
Yeah.
And and the people who get those individual jobs, the few of them that still exist at the moment, also have to enter those big interdisciplinary maps of conversation, I think. And that's good. That's one of my favorite things about this very fraught moment that we're in is that I think by and large, we have stopped being as siloed in the way that we approach each other. Again, maybe not the job market, however we try to navigate that, but the conversations have to span, have to connect. And
Yeah.
that's one thing I would say about asking people to share work with me for Scholar Sunday to circle back to our starting point here. I don't know some disciplines nearly as well as others, right? I don't know where to look. I don't know where I might find things. And I would love to have more from disciplines beyond ones that I'm more familiar with. Like some of the sociology kind of work that I've been able to share over at the
Mhm.
time has been because people have highlighted it for me or shared it with me. I
Yeah.
don't know that conversation as well. So again, that's another way to break free of the silos, at least in our collective spaces, is share them with each other because they're going to be beneficial for anybody to read and anybody to engage with, whatever the disciplines might be.
Man, I just sent you like a math thing like a
You
week or
did.
two ago. So,
Yeah, you
I'm
did.
always going to find something weird for you.
I appreciate it.
Thank you, Professor Ben. This is
Thank you.
just I would almost say I need to do this every week from you without the recording. But like, thank you
Fair.
for making a little time, and I look forward to when we can actually sit in person and just chop it up and enjoy ourselves a little bit. But this is amazing.
I agree on all counts. Thank you, Walt.
All right, let's see.